Proclus was a Neoplatonic philosopher of the 5th century. He was one of the last pagans to teach at the academy in Athens, and in some respects he may be seen as one of the last and most avid intellectual defenders of polytheism in the Greek-speaking world. One of his most intriguing teachings, from a theological perspective, is his notion of the Henads. This doctrine may be seen as an attempt to reconcile the problem of the one and the many at a foundational level for Neoplatonist metaphysics. This issue had of course a long history, and Proclus saw his own responses not as innovations, but as being in essential continuity with his predecessor Plato, as far as core doctrine was concerned. It was in the Parmenides that Plato expressed the notion, which will be one starting point of Proclus's Henadology, that the one neither is nor is one. How Plato arrived at such a statement is perhaps the most important question for the present, quite aside from any other considerations, because in terms of understanding Proclus and how his metaphysics relates to Orthodox Christianity, as I mean to explore in this video, we need to understand his presuppositions. The simple answer to our question is that Plato arrived at this statement through the dialectical method. Yet if the Parmenides is a kind of masterclass in dialectical reasoning, it also showcases the very limit of dialectics. When one arrives at such antinomies as that the one neither is nor is one, it seems fairly obvious that one has exhausted the utility of the dialectic itself. We end up with what is essentially an apophatic, that is a wholly negative, concept. Yet what Proclus will appear to attempt is to make cataphatic, that is positive, statements about the one, which go beyond the Parmenides. Before Proclus, however, Plotinus too had given the one a central position in his metaphysics, and he followed Plato's more apophatic approach, defining the one as super-essential, that is, beyond being. As such, it was also beyond non-being, which formed the other half of the dialectic in Platonic ontology, with becoming or coming to be as the middle term or copula between the two. Plotinus, however, dedicates less attention in his extant writings to the nature of the one in itself than does Proclus, who in this respect is much bolder an exegete of Plato. The main contribution to this discussion that Proclus is known for is the association of the one in Platonic terms with the pagan gods. This leads predictably to some complexity in his theology, as the existence of the gods, which he terms the Henads or ones, is understood to be beyond unity and multiplicity. This kind of opposition or dialectical relationship between unity and multiplicity is understood only to operate in the realm of being or ontology. Proclus is thus forced to distinguish between the activities of these gods, which apparently differentiates them ontologically, and their super-essential existence, in which they are all in all, or all in each. In his commentary on the Timaeus, Proclus adapts Plotinus's scheme of the three primary hypostases to accommodate his understanding of the Henads, as pictured here. The level titled nous is translated as intellect, and represents as it were the first emanation of being that proceeds from the one. It is here that the dyad of being and non-being is first manifest. Henadology. In recent scholarship, Dr. Edward P. Butler has written extensively on Proclus's theology and metaphysics of the Henads. He can help us to begin to get to grips with this tricky doctrine, and also prompt some criticisms which I will make from an Orthodox Christian perspective. The central idea we need to recognize is that the Henads are both one and many. They are the super-essential cause of the one and the many in actuality. Thus Butler writes, "There is no such thing as the one itself, if by that we mean something different from the Henads. Thus we may clearly and unequivocally distinguish the one from the one that is, the monad of being, which subsists itself as something unified." He goes on to say that being cannot except in an inferior sense contain the Henads. It must rather be the case that being, life, and intellect are in fact contained by each Henad, just as beings themselves are. The theology of Proclus is essentially apophatic, and there appears to be little room for cataphatic content. that is, positive assertions about God. In effect, the cataphatic theology is limited to a theology of proper names, for the energies of the gods do not differentiate the Henads in themselves, but only in actuality, that is, in the realm of ontology. Now we may approach what I consider to be the main objection to Proclus's metaphysics. We are made aware by Plato that the cause of being must in some sense be beyond the one and the many, but the solution Proclus offers is to my mind far from satisfactory. It is indeed hard to avoid the conclusion that the Henads are just an arbitrary multiplication of the monad, and that the reason Proclus posits them is solely because he shares the same prejudice of Eunomius and all Neoplatonists, that real distinction, and more specifically relation, is an imperfection. Indeed, Butler writes that the many Henads in which being is contained also do not pluralize it, because the Henads are not cognizable as a multiplicity in the ontological sense, that is, as a multiplicity that opposes unity only insofar as it immediately implies it, a multiplicity, in short, which unifies its members and subordinates their diversity to unity, until the intelligible and intellectual level, which corresponds to the hypostasis of life. Prior to this stage in divine emanation, we are only concerned with each individual Henad, not with relationships among them, for with relationship comes mediation, and with mediation, unification of the related terms on the basis of the relation. It seems that what this doctrine achieves is not to resolve the problem of the one and the many, but to absolutize it, creating a kind of eternal stalemate. Hence it is fair to say, I think, that this metaphysics is only an extrapolation from what Joseph P. Farrell calls the dialectic of oppositions. The dialectic, far from being the condition of full and discursive reasoning, becomes the limit of all metaphysics. Yet even this statement is too cataphatic for Proclus. That is, it asserts too much insofar as it excludes the coeternality of the unlimited. It is also hard to avoid the conclusion that the doctrine of Henads simply violates logic, although no doubt its defenders would say it transcends logic. For instance, the Henads are said to be both one and all in all, and yet entirely unique and, as it were, infinitely different. One way in which this may be conceptualized is in terms of essential qualities, or tropes, to use the modern analytical term, inhering in a subject. Every Henad has the trope of absolute oneness, yet each of them also has a trope of absolute uniqueness. We might reasonably wonder why Proclus requires that this be so, and once again I refer to his prejudice against distinctive, differentiated relationships. We can draw some interesting similarities with Trinitarian theology, although I am convinced that the Trinity genuinely resolves the issues that Proclus grapples with. For the Trinity is truly one in various senses, as in that each of the hypostases of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit may be said in analytic terms to have all the essential properties or tropes of the divine nature, but in addition to this, they have the hypostatic properties which differentiate them as persons. These hypostatic properties are referred to by St. Basil of Caesarea as the idiomata, the distinguishing marks of the divine persons. And these hypostatic properties are precisely those that reveal the mode of existence of each hypostasis. Thus the Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father. This is the classic monarchia of the Trinity. The Father is sole cause, but the Church Fathers are emphatic in asserting that this does not mean that the Son and the Spirit are subordinate to the Father. Thus St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Basil of Caesarea both wrote extended polemics against Eunomius, who believed that the generation of the Son entailed his subordination to the Father, and consequently a difference in natures. It is interesting to note that while Proclus actually voices some of the same objections as St. Gregory to the Eunomian idea that God's nature is to be unbegotten or ungenerate, he still falls into the same presuppositions of Eunomius. His solution to the perceived problem may be different, but the issue from the perspective of St. Gregory is that Proclus is in fact still framing things wrongly because of a faulty presupposition. The objection that both St. Gregory and Proclus raise is that to say God's nature is to be unbegotten is problematic, because God's nature cannot be defined by a negative determination. In fact, as Dr. Bo Branson has argued compellingly in his video, Does God Have to Have a Son?, to be unbegotten is better understood as a relative, and thus extrinsic essential property of a subject. That is, just as St. Gregory argued that to be a father presupposes the existence of a son, the term unbegotten presupposes that there is some real meaning to the concept of begetting, which must have some referent. Thus, while St. Gregory had argued in his Contra Eunomium that Eunomius was being deliberately deceptive in his substitution of the title father for the less loaded term unbegotten, this doesn't actually achieve what Eunomius wants it to achieve. Where Proclus attempts to resolve this issue, unsatisfactorily in my view, is by claiming that the Henads are self-begetting, although it is their own being which they beget according to him. As Butler asks, how can the establishment of that very idiotes, meaning the unique quality, be seen at the same time as an activity of the God, who is obviously already a distinct individual and agent? We should understand that distinction to refer to the very first sight at which emerges the distinction between the supra-essential and the ontic realm. Here each God produces him or herself. For this is being in the highest sense, the being of each God. Each God is at once in their supra-essentiality the agent of the mixture, and as primal being the mixture itself, a kind of ontic double of the God's supra-essential individuality. Thus, he too presents the begotten, which in this view is being itself, as in some sense subordinate to the one. Proclus does not seem to go as far as to say that the begetting of being is coeternal and simultaneous, however, which is where the most important distinction lies, and with it the biggest problem of this particular position. For if the begetting by the one were not instantaneous, then there would have to be some movement from potency to act in the one. But this is inconceivable for Proclus. Rather, his position has to assume that the one is in fact beyond all oppositions or relations of begetting and being begotten, which then poses the problem of how it gives rise to anything extrinsic to itself at all. While he would argue, no doubt, that there is no necessity impingent upon the one that it should necessarily produce being, nevertheless it is hard to reconcile the productive nature of the one with its absolute simplicity. The doctrine of the Trinity resolves this problem by asserting that there is no subordination between the Father and the Son, nor is there any interval or difference in essence. Rather, the Son is just as much a necessary being as the Father, for like correlatives, they mutually correspond to one another. This too resolves the problem of the one and the many, without asserting a logically problematic doctrine of Henads. For the differentiation of the hypostases is not at all arbitrary, as the alleged uniqueness of the Henads is, but is a logical consequence of their hypostatic properties. Subordination of the many in actuality. Another issue is that, in actuality, that is with reference to being, the many are subordinate to the one. There is no participation in the supra-essential existence of the Henads for contingent beings, just as for Orthodox Christians we do not participate in the divine essence in itself. But for Proclus this would seem to entail that the Henads are effectively impotent to reconcile the one and the many without subordinating the latter in actuality. This seems to follow logically from Proclus's subordination of the generate to the Henads. Thus, while the Henads are beyond both act and potency, being and non-being, their actual products are subject to dialectics. In effect, as I have said, the unity and multiplicity of the Henads cannot be actualized for Proclus, whereas for Orthodox Christians we recognize that there are uncreated divine energies or activities of the Trinity ad intra, which eternally realize this relationship in perfection. For this reason too, the creation itself is not necessarily imperfect by virtue of being manifold and differentiated. Christians rather have a doctrine of the fall, whereas for Neoplatonists what we call creation is itself a kind of fall. This has many crucial implications for Proclus's understanding of evil, a subject on which he spilt quite a lot of ink. I will continue this inquiry into Proclus's conception of evil and necessity in the next video.